Good afternoon, everyone. Today we're going to talk about something that will be, I hope, very interesting. I found it very interesting to prepare anyways, and that is using variables in workflows. And if you don't know what that is or what that means, then you'll hopefully know by the end of the webinar. You can see that I have two product logos on my slide today. That is because we're mainly going to talk about PDFToolbox. The same would actually also be valid for PDFA Pilot, the other product family from Callas. But I'm going to use PDFToolbox as an example product here. And then I'm going to talk about FileTrain and see how we can work with variables and PDFToolbox inside of FileTrain as well. So that's the two products I will be covering. So let me, I don't like presentations too much, but let me open up this presentation anyway and give you a view on what we're going to talk about. It's actually relatively simple. I want to explain what variables are and dynamic checks are in the context of PDFToolbox. Then I want to show you where you can use these in checks and fixups and profiles and what you can do with them. And then we're going to look at three different products and see how you can use these variables to build a more intelligent workflow. And that is the desktop version of PDFToolbox, and then the server/CLI version, and then FileTrain to look at this in a larger context. Let's get started here. I think everyone who was coming actually managed to join, so that's perfect. I hope you're all hearing and seeing me fine here. Let's get started. First of all, what are variables? And actually, when we talk about PDFToolbox and when we talk about checks, check is something that can look at properties of a particular PDF file or of a particular object in a PDF file. When we talk about checks, there are two types of checks that you can find in PDFToolbox. There is the normal kind, I would say, which is what we all start using first, and that is static checks, which do one particular thing. And then you have what we call dynamic checks, and a dynamic check has one or more variables inserted. And you can see a screenshot or two screenshots on my slide. On the left-hand side, you see a static check. You don't have to look at all of the details, but you can basically see that I have 150 and 220, so fixed values that are filled in. On the right-hand side, you can see something much more complex. And that gibberish that you see there are the variables. Each of those variables is identified, and that is the gibberish that you saw in the previous screenshot. Each variable is identified by three pieces of information: a description, which is humanly readable or should be humanly readable and understandable, and you'll see in a second where you would use that. A description, then a default value, and a symbolic name. And what we'll do throughout this presentation is to look at where these three pieces of information are used. But before we do so, I think it's time to close this presentation and look at software. And I've prepared a little bit, of course. So what I have open here is PDFToolbox Desktop, and let me search for the check that I want. Actually, two checks. The first one is the static check, and the second one is the variable check. Now, I've added that to the name. You can see that the name of the second check has variable between brackets at the end of the name. I don't really have to do that. If you look at the icon for that check, that purplish donut that you see on the left-hand side, you can see that for the second check, there are these three little points that you have on top of the icon. And any item in PDFToolbox where you see that ellipsis sign, these three little dots, any item that shows that, that means that that item uses a variable in some way. So if I select the first check and I edit that, you can see that indeed this does not use variables. It has fixed values. What is this check? I'll be using this throughout the whole demonstration in the different pieces of software. Well, this is a check on the size of the trim box. And the reason I chose this check is because checking page size, especially in a workflow where advertisements of different formats are received, checking page size is one of those very annoying things. If you think about ads that have different sizes, then most of the checking you want to do on these ads is equal for all advertisements. They should all be one page, they should be CMYK or maybe CMYK and spot. There is a whole range of checks you want to do. But then there is this one thing that is different, and that is the size of the ad. Because an ad can be a full page, it could be half a page, it could be a quarter page. So that is different, and you have to build a check that checks whether the trim size of that advertisement that is delivered is actually correct. And that is what I do here. I'm assuming in this check that I'm going to receive an advertisement that is 150 millimeters wide and 220 millimeters high. And then I give that some, 1 millimeter of deviation, and then I'm talking about millimeters. And I want those exact measurements, so I'm not going to ignore the orientation of the page. So that's the static check that I've built here. Now, if I look at the same thing that says variable, then you can see that it's the same pre-flight check, but this time I have this gibberish here that I was talking about. And this is defined with these orange buttons you see in here. So each time you have a check or a fix that has a little orange button next to it, that means that you can define a variable in that location. And if I open up the variable window, excuse the slight user interface problem. I'm running a very recent version of macOS 10, and this is about the only problem I've found so far with PDFToolbox. So when you look at this panel, you can see these three pieces of information that are defined. First of all, a human-readable description of what this variable means, in my case here, width of the trim box. Then a default value, and the default value means what should PDFToolbox do if I don't provide other information for this variable. And in this case, I've set it to 150 millimeters. So if I use this check in some context where I don't provide additional information, PDFToolbox is going to assume that I want to check a width of the trim box of 150 millimeters. That's what the default value means. And then I have an internal name, and that internal name is very important, and you'll see that come back in a couple of different locations down the line. So for now, just remember that we have these three pieces of information that we get to define here using that orange variable button. And I have this defined for the width. I also have it defined for the height of the trim box, exactly the same. The label is a little bit different. My default value in this case is 220, and my symbolic name or internal name for the variable in this instance is trim box height. Okay, so that is a check that was made variable by having these properties defined as variables. Let's go back to my presentation for just a second, because the next thing I want to show, and I'm going to show it rather than go over the slide here, the next thing I want to show is where these variables can be defined. We're not talking about what they do yet. We're simply talking about, if you look at checks and fixups, where can you use these things? Well, first of all, each check and each fixup has properties. And everywhere where you see these orange variable buttons, you can actually insert a variable in that property. So that's a first and very important part. And that's perhaps the most used location for variables inside of checks and fixups. But there are some other places where you can use them and where they can be just as interesting or important. And if you look at the properties of the check and the description, so the name, the description, and well, what you can fill out when it does not fire. When you look at these pieces of information, you also notice variables next to them. And that means that the name of a property, and the name of a property is important because the name of the property is what is used, or the name of the check rather, is what is used in a pre-flight report. So if I name this one DVD webinar trim box size does not equal whatever, that exact string, that exact piece of text is also going to be used in the pre-flight report when I use this check. So that name can be very important, and the name can be defined with a variable. So instead of having a fixed name, I can actually change how that particular check is reported or how that particular fix-up is reported by using a variable in here. And it looks exactly the same. I have a label, I have a default value, and an internal name. Properties of the check itself. And then, of course, the same thing holds for fix-ups, where I have properties for the fix-up and the name and the comment for the fix-up itself. Exactly the same. Now, this is not the only part. I can also go to a profile, and I have actually created a profile here. You can see that it is variable because it has these three little points on top of the icon as well. And if I open that, we can explore where we can use variables inside of a profile. So first of all, again, in the name and the description of that particular profile itself at the highest level. Then if I look at a custom check in here, or at the list of custom checks, I can insert checks that are variable or fix-ups that are variable. And again, you have these three little dots here to indicate that this is indeed a variable check that was inserted into this profile. That's already very interesting, but there is a last item that can actually be even more interesting. And that is the fact that when I select a check in the list of checks, or when I would select a fix-up in the list of fix-ups in this profile, then I have the same orange button at the bottom of my list. And if I click that, you can see that it allows me to do something a little bit different than when I have variables in a profile check, or in the conditions of a check itself. It's a little bit different in user interface, but it actually serves the same purpose. I can allow a check or a fix-up to be switched on or off using a variable. Again, I have a human readable name, except that this time it's called short description. I could call this switch the size check on or off. I have a variable name, which is the internal name that we talked about, or the symbolic name for this particular variable. And because this is a switch, I'm going to call it switch and then perhaps trim box size. And I have a default value, which in this case can only be on or off. And if I set it to on by default, then I have now created a profile where the properties of this check are variable, but where also the fact whether or not this check is going to be executed can be controlled with a variable. So when this profile is now run, I can dynamically decide to run this check or to not run this check. So it's not only the properties of a check or a fix-up, but it's also the fact if a check or fixup is going to be run that can be controlled through variables. Now, I'm going to cancel this and not save what I've been doing because I want to use the unchanged profile in the rest of my demo. But this gives you a good look at where you can define these variables. And when we go back to the slide, you can once more see the overview here. So properties of checks and fixes, that's the first thing we looked at. The properties of a profile itself, and then the enabling or disabling of checks, and actually that should be checks or fixups, because you can control whether either of those things is actually run or not in a profile. So that gives us a number of different locations where these variables can be used. Of course, that doesn't tell us what they do when you actually use them, and that's the next part that we need to look at. And then from this point on, I'm just going to not use the presentation anymore, because basically we're going to have 3 short demos. First of all, I want to take you back to PDFToolbox Desktop. The desktop, as you know, is the interactive version of PDFToolbox. So I'm expecting someone to sit behind the computer and press buttons. And if I open up my checklist again with those things that I have prepared, I can open up a very nice publication that I have prepared. If you look at the bottom of the PDFToolbox window, you'll see that this is just about 75 millimeters wide and 110 millimeters high. So I've prepared a publication, and if I run the variable check, let's see what that does. Oh, because it is variable, the first thing that PDFToolbox does is it shows me a dialog window that contains the name of this check. So again, you see that the name of a check can be very important. This is how I named that particular check. And it shows me all of the variables that I have inserted in that check. In my case, it shows me height of the trim box, width of the trim box, that is the human readable text that I added to the variables. And then it shows me 220 and 150, the default values. So if I just say OK, then it will run the check with the default values. And because obviously the size is not 150 on 220 millimeters, it fails and I get a pre-flight error. That is what we expect. Now, because this is a variable check, I can do this again. And now let's see whether we are smart enough to fill out the correct information here. So I'm requesting PDFToolbox to pre-flight on a height of 110 and a width of 75. And if I do that, you can see that it says no problems found, which is correct. The document is, in fact, 75 times 110. And because I changed the values of the pre-flight check, I now get the correct result. Are these variables really useful in PDFToolbox Desktop? It depends. Sometimes, well, let me say it differently. Mostly, you probably want to run profiles that are fully static and that just do the job. But sometimes having a possibility to make some selections and then do a test on a PDF can actually make a lot of sense. And in that case, using variables inside of PDFToolbox Desktop makes sense. You have an automated pre-flight process, but before the process is started, PDFToolbox will ask you for a number of pieces of information. So that's the first step, and we're taking baby steps here. This is manual processing with variables, not very exciting yet, but let's make this a little bit more exciting. And of course, I've selected a check here, and I've run that single check on my document. I could just as well have taken this one here and done that. And let me see what happens. This is a compliance check with PDFX1A where I added additionally that size check that I created. And if I say analyze, then I get the same information here because the only variables in this profile are the ones I've already talked about. If I do OK, then I get a number of error messages in this case. Why do I get a number of error messages? Well, this is not a PDFX file to begin with, so I get all of these PDFX error messages, and then I get my size check because I didn't change the default values, so the size check is triggered. So this works in a single check, in a single fixup, or when I run a document that contains, or a profile that contains these. What happens if I have more than one check or fix that use variables? Well, then I simply get a larger dialog window with more fields that I can fill out. So we have this profile here, and let's do something that is a little bit more interesting now. I have a PDFToolbox server running on this system as well. I've already prepared that. There is a line here that reads verify PDFX1A that represents a job with a particular profile. And what I'm going to do is open the job properties for that job. Let me open it up. You can see that the profile that I have selected here is that same profile I just ran in PDFToolbox Desktop. So this will do a check on PDFX1A and additionally that dimension check. And the rest I've set up more or less default. I've simply asked for a report on success and on errors so that we can see what is going on. So where is my hot folder for that? Here it is. So here I have an input folder and the different output folders that PDFToolbox server is watching. And what I am going to do now is I'm going to take this same beautiful penguin and copy it into the input folder. And going back to PDFToolbox, nothing will happen yet because the job is not activated. So I have to activate that job, and it picks up my file, my advertisement, and pre-flights it. And if you look at the folder, you can see that there are now two files in the error output, which is what I expect because, well, first of all, the dimensions are not correct for the check that we have built, and the file is not PDFX compliant. So let's look at the report that was generated. And indeed, I get all of these same PDFX failures, and I get a failure for my dimension check. Why do I get a failure for the dimension check? Well, because what I have configured here, let me pause that for a second. What I have configured here does not do anything with variables. The profile that I'm using, of course, has these variables defined, but nowhere here do I define new values for those variables. So PDFToolbox server can do nothing else but to use the default values that were in the check. The defaults were 150 and 220, and my file is not that, so I get the error. Now, how can I use these variables in here? Well, you can use them through these CLI parameters. That's the only way at the moment to set these for a job in PDFToolbox server. If you don't know what the CLI is, there is actually a very nice webinar with an overview of the CLI that the recording you can find on the tutorials page. But in short, this is the command line version of PDFToolbox, and it is actually what the server is using behind the scenes. And I can modify what that command line version behind the scenes does by supplying additional command line parameters. And using that trick, I can pass other values for the variables defined in my profile. and you'll have to believe me on the syntax, but it's actually not that difficult once you have an example. I need two hyphens and then set variable, an equal sign, and then, and I told you it was important, then I need the symbolic name of the variable, and hopefully I remember the logical thing I did there, trimbox width. I need a colon, and then I need the value that I want to use. Now, the check was defined with a width of 150 millimeters. What I want to check for here is 75, and I'm going to do the same for trimbox height, which is the other variable we had, and where the default value was 220 millimeters, I'm going to insert 110. So basically, I can add as many set variable parameters here as I want. And in each case, the syntax is set variable, an equal sign, the symbolic name of the variable I want to define, a colon, and the value I want to pass. So let me save that. So now we have a job that not only does it use a profile that contains variables, but it also gives PDFToolbox values instead of the defaults in that profile. So go back to my folder here. I'm going to trash whatever we have, and I'm going to copy my input file, preferably in the input folder again, and then we launch the job once more with the changes. PDFToolbox server picks that up, and it is done. And if we are, I was going to say for lucky, but luck has nothing to do with it. If I did everything correctly, and I did, then you can see a difference here. There is still a red cross because there are still all of these PDFX errors generated by the pre-flight step. But if you look at the errors that we get this time, then you can see that the dimensions error that we received before is no longer there. Why? Well, the profile has those variables. I specified different values for those variables, and the document that I'm checking indeed has a width of 75 and a height of 110. So this time the pre-flight goes without any problem. Now, the fact that you can specify these variables for a job in PDFToolbox Server is very nice. That means that I can now build a single profile. I can put some variables in there, and then I can use multiple jobs in PDFToolbox Server, and each time, using that set variable trick, I can modify how PDFToolbox Server is going to pre-flight my file. Same profile, different processing behavior. And remember that this allows me not only to change the properties of a check or a fixup, such as the dimensions, but it also allows me to switch on or off individual checks and fixes. So all in all, this is a very powerful way to modify the pre-flight behavior of a PDFToolbox server. However, there is a major limitation to this approach, and you might have already seen what I mean, but the limitation is that I can only change the variables on a job level. I can create multiple jobs, and for each job I can put different command line parameters that modify the values that I want to use. But this is a job or a hot folder setting. What I cannot do, and what I very much would like to do, is modify the value of the variables for each file that I process. So basically what I would like to do is be able to look at files as they come in, and then do a different pre-flight, depending on the name of the file, for example, or some metadata that is associated with the file. How do we do that? Well, We can't do this in PDFToolbox Server. Like I said, this is a limitation that you have in PDFToolbox Server. But, of course, there is a solution, or I would not have brought this up. But there is other things we can do. We could use the CLI, but that gets very technical. And what I wanted to do here is to show you something a little bit different. And to do that, I want to go to FileTrain. If you've seen the webinar about FileTrain, then you know what it is. If you haven't seen it, I would first of all advise you to go look at the webinar. But secondly, I can summarize it very shortly or very briefly as an automation tool. FileTrain allows you to set up what is called stations, and each station is basically an automated workflow. And I've built a workflow here, and what I will process with that workflow is something to implement exactly what we talked about. So what I have prepared here are these 4 files. And that's the PDF file we've been using, and then you can see that there is an XML file with the same name, and then I have a variant of that, again, the PDF and an XML. And you'll have to trust me, but the PDFs are actually identical. The size is the same, and it's just a copy, basically, where I changed the name. This one has half page at the end of the name. The XML files are actually different. And let me open these in a text editor so I can explain what is going on here. These XML files could be XML files that are generated by a web portal or an MIS system or an order tracking system or something like that. What you see is a very simple XML file that says job ticket. It has some information about the environment where this was supposedly generated. Don't go looking for something called journal publisher because I invented it yesterday. And it has information about the publication. So the idea is that this publication section contains information that was gathered by the system or inputted by the user on the advertisements that they upload to this web portal. And you can see some things here: name, a publication code, an issue, publication date, and this is what interests us the most. You can see that, if I did it properly, it should be called half page as the format name for this version, and then a size of 150 and 220. And if I look at the XML file for the other one, it says quarter page, 75 and 110. So basically, what this does, or what this is a PDF that was uploaded to a portal, and then an XML file with metadata describing that PDF file. Now, what do you want to do in a workflow? I want to look at the information out of that XML, and I want to use that information from the XML to do my pre-flight. For example, and this is the example that we're going to look at here, I want to pick up this information here about the size of the document that the user has provided or has selected in my web portal, and I want to compare that information to the actual size of the PDF file. And then for this file, I shouldn't get any error messages because the information in the XML says 75 and 110, and that is exactly the size of the PDF. For the other files, my XML says that the width is 150 and the height is 220. However, I already said that the documents are identical, and if you don't believe me, here you have the half-page document, and it is 75 and 110. So this one is not correct. So I want to build something where the first file actually goes through without errors, and the second file gives me a pre-flight error. And that requires that I am able to pre-flight using that information from the metadata and passing that information to the variables that I have defined in that pre-flight check. And like I said, that is not possible in PDFToolbox Server, because that is basically modifying the variables for each document that you're processing. But let me open up the other folder that I had here. And this looks very simple. I have an input folder here and then some output folders. I'm going to copy this into the input folder. And then when I go to FileTrain, let me move it aside a little bit. So when I go to FileTrain, I've built a workflow here, and that does a bunch of stuff. I'll explain what it does in a second. But what I'm going to do now is start that station. We should see on the right-hand side is that it will pick up these documents and do something with them. So you can see that one of the documents already went through, and I end up with something that is called logs. And this is information that I used while I was figuring out how this could work. It's a text file. If I open it up, you can see that it simply contains the original XML with all the metadata, and then it's extracted, and it shows me that I correctly extracted this width and height out of the XML. But the most important piece of information is here. It's in the reports section, a reports folder. PDFToolbox, driven by FileTrain, did a pre-flight on those PDF files, and it used that variable check that I had defined. And it generated two reports, a report for my regular file and a report for the one that contains half page. Now, let's open up the regular one first. If you remember, I said we should not get error messages because I'm basically here using a profile that only contains that dimension check. And because the metadata corresponds to the actual size of the PDF in this case, I get no errors or warnings. I get a green check mark. That's exactly what we wanted. If I look at the report for the second file, I said I want to get an error message in that case. And lo and behold, I have an error message. Why? Because the file is 75 millimeters wide, while my XML metadata in this case says to pre-flight at 150 millimeters wide. So the metadata does not match the PDF, and in this case I get a pre-flight error. And of course the example that I built here is very, very simple. It only has one variable check, and it only looks at one piece of information out of this XML file. But you can see that the way this works here is very easily translatable to workflows where you have many more variables and where you decide on the fly to modify the values of the checks that are done, or modify on the fly whether or not a check is going to be done on particular documents. And in order to decide whether a check is done or what the values are of these variables, you could use all kinds of information. You could look at the document name, but in my case, what I do is I simply look for the XML file, and I get some data out of the XML file. Now, this is not a webinar about FileTrain, so I don't want to take up too much time examining what we've done here, but I do think it's important to understand how this works, and this will show how you can transfer this information from within the FileTrain environment to that profile that is executed in PDFToolbox. And if you look at this, you can see that there is one source for this station, and that source is basically this input folder that I have defined here. So FileTrain will look at and pick up all files in that particular input folder. And then from that folder, it will pick up and do something with each file that satisfies that filter that you see here. And if I double click on that filter, we can watch what it does. And what it does is it looks for PDF documents, so it only processes PDF documents. And then it also looks at a file with the same name as the PDF file, but with the extension XML. So if I drop a single PDF file into that input folder, it is not going to do anything because, yes, it's a PDF file, but there is no corresponding file that has the XML extension. So basically, this filter processes these pairs of files that I have prepared. A pair of files where there is a PDF and a matching XML file. That's what that filter does. And then if it finds that PDF with a matching XML file, it is going to execute these actions on there. And to go briefly over what it does, well, first of all, I want the other one. There you go. So let me arrange that a little bit for you. First of all, what it does is it looks at that XML file that we waited for, and it stores the content of that XML file in a what FileTrain calls bucket, basically a place where I can store information for that PDF file. So metadata, if you want, associated with that PDF file. So I simply store the full XML text inside this location. Then next, I extract something out of that, so out of this job ticket XML, which is the XML file itself. And what I extract is an XPath expression that basically will give me the trimmed width value. And if you recall how this XML file looked, trimmed width and trimmed height are the element names, the node names of the values that I'm interested in that XML file. So these two simply extract something from the XML, and again, they store it inside of a piece of metadata associated with my document. That's all this step does. Now, because XPath expressions have never been what I loved most in life, and I typically get them wrong the first time I try them, I actually inserted a debug action. And that debug action is an action that writes out a text file. And if I open it up, you'll see that it writes out a file in the logs folder, and that's this folder you see next to the action. And the name of the file will be the original file name followed by a .text extension. That's exactly what you see here. And the content of the file is these pieces of metadata, these buckets that I just filled with information out of my XML document. So basically, this gives me a text file, and that text file makes it possible to very quickly verify that I did the right thing. And as you saw before, what we had in the text file was the complete XML. That's what I stored first, and then later it said trimbox width, and then what was received or what was parsed from that XML, and the trimbox height that was parsed from that XML. So this is a debug action. You wouldn't need it in a production workflow, but believe me, it was very useful when building this workflow to make sure I was doing the right thing. Now, perhaps the most important part here, because the rest is basically cleanup that says once we're done, move that XML file into the processed originals folder and move the original PDF file into the processed originals folder. So that's basically cleanup. The most important action is this variable pre-flight with PDFToolbox. This is the key to what happens here. And if I open it up, you can see that FileTrain has a built-in plugin for controlling PDFToolbox. You could also use the command line version of PDFToolbox if you prefer, but you have this plugin that makes life a little easier. And the plugin allows you to run some of the actions that PDFToolbox supports, like save as image, but it also allows me to run a profile. And again, I'm using the same check as what I was using before in PDFToolbox. So this is this variable check that we keep talking about. I could limit this to a certain page range. I can choose to run Fixups or not. Now this is just a check, so that's irrelevant. More importantly, I can generate reports in a certain language and as many reports as I want. And because I wanted to see what the result was of my pre-flight, I have chosen to always generate a report. It's a template report, which means that it is one of those HTML templates that are converted by PDFToolbox to PDF files. If you don't know how that works, there is actually a good webinar about that, so go look on the tutorials page. But that is what I do here, a template report. I can specify where the template is that I want to use, and then I get to specify the folder for these, and that is the reports folder. That seemed logical. And then I get to specify the name, and I chose to use the original name of the file. So you can see purple paint for penguins. That's the original PDF file name. Added to that underscore report and then .pdf. So this determines where and the actual name of the report that is generated. Then I decide where the actual file will be saved, but because I'm only doing pre-flight here and not changing the document, I don't actually get an output file. So this is not very important in my example workflow. And the most important part, perhaps, dynamic values. And dynamic values is where you set the values for the different variables that you have in the profile. Now, first of all, notice that FileTrain is smart enough to automatically extract which variables you have in this profile. I selected a profile here, and it automatically shows me that there are two variables inside of that profile, trimbox height and trimbox width. That doesn't surprise us because we put them there, but it is very nice to be able to not have to type them and remember that symbolic name, but simply have FileTrain list them for you. And if I select one of the variables, I now get to select what value I want to pass to PDFToolbox. Now, I could, let me copy this, I could do the same thing I did in PDFToolbox server. I could say, well, the height, instead of 220, I want to check for 110. That's something that I could do. I can actually, if I don't remember, I can simply click the Set Default Value button, and in that case, FileTrain will look up what the default value of this variable is in that profile, and it will fill that out for me. But I can change it to a fixed value. What I'm doing here, of course, is something different. What I'm doing here is I'm collecting a bucket, so again, that metadata that was associated with the PDF file. And in this case, I'm collecting the metadata called job ticket underscored trimmed height. And that is where I stored the height of the trim box that I got from the XML file. And the same for width, but except, of course, that I now collect the metadata where I stored the width of the trim box that came out of the XML. So basically, by setting this up in this way, I've built a workflow where an XML file enters my workflow. That XML file is parsed, and some pieces of information are extracted from that XML file by means of those XPath instructions. And that information that was extracted from the XML is now passed on to the variables that I have inside of PDFToolbox in the profile for PDFToolbox. So I've connected the metadata that lives in the FileTrain universe, in my example coming in from that XML file, to the variables that we had defined in the PDFToolbox universe inside of that profile. And that is a very powerful combination, especially, of course, if you remember that FileTrain can not only automate PDFToolbox, but that it has this long list of other actions that you can use in that same automated workflow. So I could have gotten that information out of a database. I have a very nice workflow here with databases, but it would take too long to explain today. It's going to be its own webinar by itself, but I could get that information not out of an XML file, but out of a database. I can get the PDF files through email. I could get the metadata out of the email. I could collect the PDF files from an FTP server. So I have all kinds of different additional work I can do around that action for PDFToolbox that gives me a very flexible workflow. This is the last thing I actually wanted to show. Let me very briefly go back to my presentation just to show you that there is no additional information in here, but mainly to show you the last slide with all of the useful websites and email addresses. If you have any questions, now would be a really good time to enter them in your GoToWebinar control panel. Let me very briefly summarize before I take a look at those questions. So what we talked about today is the fact that PDFToolbox has a concept that is called a variable, and that concept allows me to build static versus dynamic checks. So it allows me to make a static check dynamic. That is the proper way to say it. Those variables can be used to modify the properties of a check or a fixup, or they can be used to modify the properties of a profile, or they can be used to switch an individual check or fixup on or off inside of a profile. All of these things are possible. And then what we saw is that you can run these variables or use these variables in PDFToolbox Desktop, where there is an interactive way to change the values that will be used, and then you can use them in an automated way in PDFToolbox Server. We saw that the limitation there was that basically you can set variables on a job level in PDFToolbox Server, but not for individual files. And then we built a workflow in FileTrain where you can see that inside of FileTrain you can take advantage of the metadata that you derive in the FileTrain context, whether it is from XML or from an email or from a database or something else, and you can pass that metadata to the variables that you have defined in the PDFToolbox profile that you are using. So that gives you a very powerful way to build a fully customizable or fully dynamic workflow using PDFToolbox Server and using. Okay, let me take a look at whether there are any questions in here. Just a second. There is a question about using the variables manually in a profile. Well, basically, if you add them manually in a profile, you're doing the same thing as when you're using the orange boxes in the dialog. And the value that will be used to run, the value that will be used for a variable when you run it on a file is always determined by, first of all, is there any explicit value that you set using a -- set variable parameter or any of the other methods that you've seen. So is there any explicit value set? If so, then that value is always used. If not, then it's automatically the default value that is contained in the profile check or fixup. So if you set a value using set variable, it will always override what you specify in a profile check or fixup using the orange variable button. I'm not sure whether I totally got your question there, Mark. If I don't, just send me an email afterwards, and I'll be happy to go into more details. But that is how they are executed. The manual way of setting values is always takes precedence over whatever default value you have. The default value is only used if there is no other value that is passed into the profile. Okay, looks like that was the only question today. If you look at this afterwards and you come up with other questions, or you have questions on how you could implement this in your own workflows, don't hesitate to come back to us and ask for advice or more information. We'll be happy to give that. You can see contact information on the last slide of the presentation. Like I said, the presentation is being or has been recorded. It will be posted on the website together with the presentation itself, the slides, and so you'll receive access to all of that, of course. Okay, that concludes the webinar for today. I hope you found it interesting. Thank you very much for joining this webinar in the midst of the summer. It is very much appreciated, and I'm sure I will see many of you again in the coming webinars in this summer school series. Thank you very much and have a great day.